An individual, a team with a built-in quality mindset applies both the dependency inversion principle and the practice of test-driven development to everything that they do, not just the things we traditionally think of, but everything. The dependency inversion principle, simply stated, is, if you will, Stephen Covey put it this way, begin with the end in mind. Think in terms of that end state and what that's going to look like, how you're going to work with that, before trying to dig into the details of how you're going to make that happen. Test-driven development says before you start developing something, first write a test that shows you that it is doing it the right way. Put another way, make sure that the test both fails for the right reason and passes for the right reason. Come up with a way to execute that test. Optimally, you would automate that test. If a team is beginning with that mindset, then during the user story refinement, you'll nail that down pretty well in your acceptance criteria. Your story will be highly cohesive. You'll be ready then to do the test planning. And so the test planning is really where everybody on the team, not just the testers, but everybody on the team gets involved in thinking through how are we going to be able to test this to make sure we got it right. Not just that it's acceptable and we can deploy it, but that we got it right. That's the functional testing. Now, there's a lot of non-functional testing. I call it infrastructure testing, and it has to do with security, performance, things like that. Most all of those things are affected by the way the environments or the infrastructure is configured and managed. It doesn't have to do with the way the product functions. Sometimes those performance issues and security issues are based on the way the code was written, certainly. But there's a functional aspect that even if we got the security right, who cares if the product doesn't even function correctly? So the functional testing I'm talking about is making sure that the app functions the way it's supposed to. So here's the way that I go about that. I used to do what most people do and try to think about all the different types of testing and phases of testing and error conditions and ranges of things and boundary conditions. And I tried to come up with all these different scenarios that way. And then I don't remember how it happened, but I stumbled on this approach that I use now. I realized that in the user story, if I've refined it correctly and I've refined it really well, and it's very cohesive, then really I'm testing one specific action or event. That's it. I'm going to test it under various data scenarios and or system states, but I'm always going to look for the same test subject. I'm going to verify the same properties or aspects of that test subject on every execution, but I'm going to execute it under a variety of data scenarios and system states. So there's a way that I can actually document that in the user story itself. What I do is I take the acceptance criteria given when and then, I copy it and I paste it down below the everything else that I've done up to that point. I put it in a section called functional testing. And I take the given statement at the top. Let's say it's our login scenario that we talked about in another video. Given valid credentials, when they are submitted, then the landing page appears. Okay. Copy that, put that down in a functional testing section, and I take the given statement and I actually move it to the bottom. So now it reads, when the login credentials are submitted, then the landing page appears, given valid credentials. Okay. Now what I do is I think to myself, what are all the different scenarios in which submitting login credentials should result in that landing page appearing? Okay. Now, this is going to differ on the system, but I'll give you some thoughts and ideas in general. You might have an admin user and a customer. Okay. You want to make sure both of those, the landing page shows up the way it should for each one of them. Let's say you have permissions differences, that certain things should be available in the navigation for an admin or a user, so different permission levels. But then you might have different customers that have different levels of access to things. So certain things on that landing page should show up differently based on what the permissions levels are. You might have different locales. So if I have somebody with this locale, then the landing page will show up with this language displayed. Currencies, okay, the stuff that shows up on the landing page should have the right currency displayed based on that user. There are a myriad of different scenarios, but they're all based on the data scenario and or the system state. And so I can put those down at a list of givens. So now I have when, then, and a whole list of givens for all those different scenarios, all in my user story. I don't have to have it in a separate test case management tool. I don't have to track it differently. I don't have to have a separate test case for each one of those. I can have the one test case, but executed, even in a manual way, executed separately for each one of those different given statements. Makes things much more concise. If we're automating this, the automation engineer now has a very clear idea of how to automate that. Okay, the when statement tells the action that's going to be executed. They can make sure that that's written up in the automation, coded up, so it's actually taking that action, let's say on a web page or a web service call. The then statement says what it is they're going to validate. So they're going to look at a web page, they're going to look at a web service body, they're going to look at something and make sure that the data in there is verified, make sure that it's correct. Okay, so now I know what the verification is. Now those different givens, the different data scenarios and system states, you know what? If you have a modern test engine tool like TestNG, you usually have a way to set up the data provider with a list of all of the different data scenarios. And you can tell it to run that one test case once for every data scenario and verify the results are right. If your verifications are data-driven and the expected result is determined at execution time based on that test data, now it's fully automatable. That one test, multiple data scenarios, and you're done. And you can see that clearly in the user story. You don't have to have a lot of documentation elsewhere. You can have it there. After you're done, the testing becomes your test case management tool. That's where they're managed. Now you have now maximize the things not done, right? Now you've maximized the need to have yet a third way of managing test cases that's separate from the user stories and separate from the automation. So now you have to link them all together. You've now done away with that, especially if you also include in the test code the ability to annotate it with a user story ID. Now that's your link. It's just a documented reference, but that's your link between the test and the user stories that it fulfills, right? So that's how I go about doing my functional test planning. It really isn't any harder than that. Again, for the non-functional things, the infrastructure type things, you certainly want to figure out how your company is going to approach that, what that integration is like. A lot of times there's a whole separate team of people that does that testing specifically. And so you want to include that in your user story refinement and in your test planning there that you do, but keep it concise. Try to use some similar approach to where you can keep it all documented right there, keep it clean, keep it short, and do it all prior to estimating the user story. So I hope you'll reconcile yourself to that simple way of doing your test planning and experience the benefits of that.